There's enough data to suggest that there are things operating within our own airspace that is A, it's not ours. B, we're pretty sure it's not foreign adversarial. C, it's been doing this for a long time. And D, there's not a whole lot we can do about it.
When it continues to happen as a pattern, that is when we get to the point where we now become increasingly concerned. Because it's not an anomaly, now it's a trend. And if it's a trend, then we need to look at it.
There are many documented and rumored cases of UAPs flying over sensitive military installations, and at times even interfering with electronics and mechanisms to do with national defense. Based on what you know so far, can you shed light on whether this has been seen by leadership to be aggressive in nature, probing in nature, or in fact a demonstration of technological superiority?
Christina, let's take the topic of UAP and set it aside for just a moment and say some foreign adversary has the technology to fly over our nuclear capabilities and interfere with them, whether it's nuclear propulsion, nuclear power, like our power grid, or nuclear weapons, right? In any scenario, that's a bad scenario. Anybody who has the ability to interfere with that without our ability to counter it is a problem. And that's why if I were to go to an active nuclear silo today, I would probably be met with some very angry individuals with machine guns pointing at me, and asking some very hard questions. That's just the nature of the beast. It's part of our crown jewels on how we protect this country, both as a nuclear deterrence and also strategic capabilities. So now let's go ahead and reintroduce the UAP topic and say that there's some sort of technology that's flying over our nuclear capabilities. There's not a damn thing we can do about it and can turn our nuclear capabilities offline at will. Is that a problem? Well, my response to you is yes, it's a very significant problem. If that is indeed the case, we need to figure out what's going on. And it appears that that may very well be the case. So if that is the case, and by the way, it's not just here, Russia's had some interesting events too. I won't go into a lot of detail. This is a global issue. This isn't just a US and Russia issue. This is a global issue. And I think, what is their intent? Are they trying to do quote unquote show of force? Are they trying to, be friendly, as some people have suggested, and warn us? Or is it some sort of reconnaissance and as you say, probing capability? Yeah, it could be any of the above, could be all the above. And that's, again, part of the problem. We don't know. There's a big information gap there. And yeah, it's fun to speculate. A lot of people will have a different opinion on this topic, but I think it's too early to tell. I think it's frankly dangerous for us to have any type of conclusive statement one way or the other until we have more information on this. Why is there an interest in our nuclear technology?
So you can see from a national security perspective, there are national security implications to this. Now, if you ask me as a human being, is it a national security threat? I think my answer to you would be, it could be if it wanted to be. It has the potential to be. I'm not saying they're a threat. What I'm saying is that they could be if they wanted to be. Or it could be if it wanted to be. So as a result, you pay your Department of Defense to protect this country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. That's what it says. So you want a Department of Defense to consider this a potential national security threat until it can prove it's not. So that's why in my job, look, if this was a humanitarian thing and everybody was here for peace and sing kumbaya, give it to the State Department, give it to an NGO, give it to USAID. That's not DOD's job. DOD's job is to go fight and win wars quickly. That is what you pay us to do. And so that is why there was a national security nexus. Because if it was anything other than national security, the DOD would not be involved. The Air Force wouldn't be involved, Navy wouldn't be involved, most likely CIA wouldn't be involved, DIA and everybody else. It is a national security issue. Is it a threat? I don't know. But it is an issue, in my opinion.
Is UAP a threat?
Well, depends how you define it. If I, as I told you before, if I stick my head behind the jet engine of a 47 as it's powering up. Is that a threat? Well, it's not intending to be a threat to me, but yeah, it's a threat to my health, to my biology. If you have these UAPs that are coming in and around civilian aircraft where now it's a flight safety issue, yeah, that's a threat. Now, it may not be an existential threat, but it's still a threat. I mean, if my family was on that plane and got buzzed by a UAP, I'd be pretty pissed, you know? And oh, by the way, nobody wants to report it. Well, you know, that's not your call. You should report it because it's their safety issue. Now, let's put that into the context of what I've always talked about. And I know people, you know, keep telling, well, you need to have a new analogy, Lou, but it's the one that works. Is this a national security threat? The bottom line is we don't know. And it goes back to the whole, you know, analogy I use about muddy boot prints. At night, you go, and before you go to bed, you lock your front door, you lock your windows, you turn on your alarm. You know, even though we all live in safe places, no one expects anything bad to happen. But let's say one morning you wake up and come down to have a nice cup of coffee or tea, and there's muddy boot prints now in your living room carpet that weren't there the night before. Now, no one's been hurt, nothing's out of place, nothing's been taken. But despite you locking the doors and the windows and turning on the alarm, there are muddy boot prints now in your living room that weren't there the night before. The question to you is that a threat? Well, my answer is it could be if it wanted to be, so we should probably figure it out. And so that's probably the way I would answer that question. The most concerning, not most compelling, but the most concerning are those incidents that involve our nuclear equities. There seems to be a very distinct congruency between UAP, associated UAP activity, and our nuclear technology, whether it be propulsion or weapon systems or whatnot. And that's concerning to the point where we've actually had some of our nuclear capabilities disabled by these things. So, you know, again, let's put this in the context of foreign adversarial technology. If Russia or China had the ability to disable our nuclear strike capability or defense capability, that's pretty significant.
And several of these UFO sightings have been above secret nuclear weapons facilities. Almost every major nuclear power across the globe really has reported and declassified these sightings. You have talked extensively about the connection here, which might be helpful, I think, for some people to hear in advance of my next question, which is whether or not the U.S. government has considered utilizing nuclear-powered naval fleets to lure these kinds of things to further study them.
Yes, that is one of the concerns we have from a national security perspective, that there does seem to be some sort of congruency or some sort of intersection between these UAP or UFO sightings and our nuclear technology, whether it's nuclear propulsion, nuclear power and generation, or nuclear weapon systems. Furthermore, those same observations have been seen overseas in other countries. They too have had the same incidents. So that tells us this is a global issue. Now, in this country, we've had incidents where these UAPs have interfered and actually brought offline our nuclear capabilities. And I think to some, they would probably say, well, that's a sign that whatever this is something that is peaceful. But in the same context, we also have data suggesting that in other countries, these things have interfered with their nuclear technology and actually turned them on, put them online. So that is equally, for me, just as concerning. I think that there is certainly at this point enough data to demonstrate there is an interest in our nuclear technology, a potential to even interfere with that nuclear technology. And when you look at all these naval ships out there, let's take the Nimitz battle carrier fleet, for example. In some cases, you're talking about a nuclear footprint probably bigger than most cities. You have a nuclear-powered carrier with aircraft on board and then you have nuclear-powered destroyers. You have nuclear-powered submarines, some of those with nuclear weapons on board, or certainly nuclear capabilities. I'll just say that. So I think it shouldn't be a surprise that maybe there is an increased interest in our capabilities as it relates to our nuclear technology, and the Navy is certainly not immune to that.
The USS Omaha, the information that we released, it was one of at least 5 different ships that were buzzed in July 2019 by these unknowns, and they weren't able to see them coming in, they weren't able to see them leaving. And it seemed like these things wanted to be seen. They were making a display or a performance. The USS Omaha Sphere travels with the ship right along with it for like an hour. It's like, hey, take some close-ups. Here I am. And then it goes in the water. I know that we have increased technical capabilities and sensors to track things like this, unknowns, to track the adversaries and enemies. But is there a point at which we can say the phenomenon is upping its game, that it is making itself known in a more demonstrable way than we have seen before?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, George. And the question is, are we beginning to notice an uptick, if you will, in provocations, or what we would call in defense terms show of force? It's not uncommon that we will display our capabilities to an enemy or an adversary. They will, of course, do the same with us in order to demonstrate our capabilities. Basically, a warning: don't mess with us, because look what we can do. The question you're asking is what we are witnessing here a potential provocation. In essence, look at this technology that we can do. You don't have it, so better be careful. I don't know. It's certainly, I think if you talk to certain folks inside the intelligence community, they may come up with that assessment that this is clearly someone or something trying to be obvious and say, look, we're here and we don't really respect your your distances and whatnot, these limitations and restrictions you put on your vessels. We're going to do whatever we want. That's possible. It could also be something that is unintentional. Now, when I say unintentional, deliberate in that they're there, but not necessarily trying to provoke a response. Maybe it is just as curious about us as we are curious about it. So we have to be careful assigning intent behind something. I think that's certainly a natural question, but I don't think we have enough data yet to address that. From a threat perspective in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, there's really two parts of an equation to determine if something is a threat, and that is capabilities versus intent. Now we are seeing some of the capabilities up close and personal, that's for sure, but we still have no idea the intent, and so therefore it's really a tough egg to crack, because we really have no idea why these things seem to be so provocative and pervasive.
At a minimum, it would seem to be surveillance, isn't it? Or it's an interactive quality to it. It's not hiding, it's right there, and it seems to be congregating around military facilities, ships, things like that.
Well, that for me is the greatest problem, and that for me is the greatest question and challenge. Why is it that we see a large frequency of these incidents occurring in and around controlled U.S. airspace, and particularly around military assets and equities? That for me is the biggest question, because you're right. From an adversarial perspective, certainly that would be indicative of some sort of show of force. But again, we just simply don't have enough data. And I think probably this is why people in Congress and the government are taking this topic so seriously, because we spend millions and millions of dollars each year trying to protect our military assets and equities from the enemy, from a wide spectrum of threats, whether it's an intelligence or a physical threat or whatnot. And yet we still have no idea what these things are or what they're doing in and around our military equities.
You and I have talked about this before. You've made public statements. I've had my own reports, news reports over the years about the interest of whatever this unknown intelligence is, the interest in nuclear capabilities, nuclear missile bases, nuclear carriers, nuclear power plants. And you have remarked how concerned you are about that. Can you say, and again, this is pretty sensitive, but can you address the idea of whether or not we have tried to confirm their interest in nuclear assets? Say an experiment. If we do X, will they do Y?
Yeah. So, George, I can tell you definitively, we know there's a connection, there's a congruency, because there is official U.S. government reporting going back decades from very senior officials to other very senior officials that have established and substantiate the fact that there is UAP interest in our nuclear equities. So that's a fact. That's already occurred. We have reporting on that through certain channels, and the evidence is quite compelling. The question is why, and that is something we don't know yet. As far as going into details, specifics about our nuclear equities, unfortunately, I'm not at liberty to do that, because when you start getting into the sources and methods and specifics, that information becomes quite sensitive very quickly. But there is already reporting that has been made available to the open public, if you know where to look for it, that substantiates without a shadow of a doubt that there is interest in our nuclear equities. And let me further state that it's not just ours; it's also other countries as well. And for me, that is probably even more indicative of the fact that we may be dealing with something here that we really don't understand. Because if we're having the same problem that Russia is in other countries, then chances are this is a topic that is of mutual concern and interest for more than just the United States. In fact, it would paint a picture that this is not a U.S. phenomenon at all, but this is rather a global phenomenon.
Quickly, there seems to be some connection, anecdotally there is, between these objects and nuclear reactors, nuclear warheads, nuclear-powered vehicles, submarines and warships. We didn't get nuclear technology, of course, until the end of the Second World War, 44, 45. We had airplanes. We had an Army Air Corps going back to the First World War. Were there sightings of these before the United States possessed nuclear technology?
There were anecdotal sightings, but really there seems to be a significant uptick. Once the United States and other countries really entered into the atomic age, we began to see an increased uptick, what appeared to be some sort of reconnaissance or surveillance of our nuclear technology, our nuclear development, whether it's power or propulsion or weapon systems and related technology.
Yeah. One factor I want to bring to your attention, the Nimitz Tic Tac event out there, in my research, I found something that might be a factor of why those craft were out in that area. Have you ever heard of Naval Operation Wigwam? Operation Wigwam.
I'm not familiar with Wigwam. Was that is that an electronic warfare scenario that's run out there in the training area? I'm not familiar with Wigwam.
Roger. No, it's not. They detonated a 30 kiloton nuclear weapon 2,000 feet below the surface, 400 miles southwest of San Diego. Now, the Tic Tac was about 100 miles southwest of San Diego. So as quickly as these craft moved, they were in that vicinity. And we know how these craft have had such an interest in our nuclear activities. They may have been very curious as to why they're detecting underwater radiation because there's radiated objects are on the bottom, barges.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Can you tell me again one more time the yield of the kiloton yield that was part of Wigwam?
30
kilotons. So that's roughly 4 times larger than what we had on Hiroshima, which was a 13 kiloton. So that's pretty sizable. Do you know again, I'm going to ask you a dumb question here. Do you know the approximate depth that was detonated?
Yes, 2,000 feet.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah. So that's definitely up in the Pacific.
A lot of good videos. They declassified a lot of the film from that period of time. It's fascinating. And I'll send some information to Martin that he can forward to you. But, when I saw the Wigwam, I actually ran into a veteran who was out there in a ship.
Wow.
And he told me about it. And then when I saw the Tic Tac, I said, they're right out in that vicinity. Because,
Rob, that's a really interesting point. One of the I think one of the conclusions that we can say almost definitively is that there does appear to be some sort of nuclear connection. And if you look at the Nimitz carrier strike group, you're looking at a potential nuclear footprint that is very considerable. You're looking at first of all, you're looking at nuclear powered aircraft. You're looking at potentially some nuclear powered vessels that are also supporting and escorting the aircraft carrier. You're looking at nuclear capable submarines that are not just nuclear powered, but in some cases may have nuclear weapons on board. And so when you look at that in total, that's a pretty significant nuclear footprint, all concentrated in a very small, tight geographic area. And it's something that we have considered before, and we continue to see that pattern over and over again. But as far as Operation Wigwam, I wasn't familiar. Was that back in the 1950s?
Yes, it was actually almost 66 years to the day, May 14th, 1955.
That makes sense. Interesting. Well, I'll tell you what, you always learn something new. And I'm going to, if you don't mind, whatever information you're willing to send would be most appreciated. And I'm going to look at that too. That's really neat. Thank you for sharing. That's fascinating.
Yeah, you bet. Just very quickly, this may be a clue to the vulnerability of these unknowns. Is that if they're running along with some kind of an anti-gravity or gravitational assist or control, a nuclear generated electromagnetic pulse may interrupt their control and thrust. And you can imagine if you're going along in a bubble of your own gravity and something interrupts it, you could end up like a bug on a windshield. And
certainly what is being looked at right now. I'll be careful not to pontificate too much, but there is definitely some speculation that if that is what is being used, that perhaps an EMP may be able to interfere with that technology. That's something that has been. I think
it's their Achilles heel. And just quickly, I'll close because Commander Fravor said as soon as they painted that object, the Tic Tac, with his radar, it started jamming their radar. He said in every way you can. And then Kevin Day said at one time it was raining UFOs, which is classic radar jamming. So they are very, very concerned when they get painted with radar because they know we've got nuclear devices.
Yeah.
And Harry Reid said something that I found to be really interesting. He said, of all the information I have, and I quote, of all the information I have, which is quite a bit, I think there's no indication whatsoever that they're harmful, being whatever is operating the UFOs that have the 5 observables. Kind of scary. Then he goes on to say, kind of scary to be honest with you, but there's no indication of there being a reason to be afraid of them. But I think they're big time scary. What do you make of that statement from Harry Reid?
We talk about the potential threat, right? But people automatically assume when you say there's a potential threat, they think, oh, you're going down the fear mongering avenue, and you're talking about hostile intent. We're not. There is a distinct difference between a potential threat and something being hostile. Let me give you an example. If one of these UAP flies next to a 737 full of 250 passengers while, kicking back on their way to Los Angeles, and it gets too close, and now the pilot has to take evasive maneuvers, is that a threat? Well, yes, of course it's a threat. It's an air safety threat, right? It's an issue. Is it necessarily hostile? No. It doesn't mean it's necessarily being hostile. If I go to an airport, and I've said this analogy over and over again, if I get on an airplane, that's not the jet engine isn't a threat to me. But if I jump out of the airplane and I walk around to the back of the engine when it's firing up, is that a threat to me? Well, yeah, it's a threat to my health and safety. Chances are I'm going to get burned. I'm probably going to lose my hearing. Mm-hmm. There's going to be some consequences of that. It's not necessarily the intention of the jet engine to hurt me. It's just that it's the nature of the technology. So I want to make sure that people understand that when certainly when I'm talking about a potential threat, it doesn't necessarily mean hostile intent. We haven't seen any overt hostile intent yet. Okay.
Well, the Italians might say different.
Well, the Italians absolutely will say something different.
I feel like a lot of people kind of missed that one in season 1.
And not just Italy, but some folks in Brazil would say the same thing. Yeah. So there's a few countries that have said, whoa, not so fast. We've had different experiences. But that aside, I think we need to approach this cautiously and deliberately. I don't think there's any cause for panic. I'm certainly not going to sit there and raise my hands and say, oh, welcome, brother. I'm just not that guy. It's like if I have a new neighbor that moves into the neighborhood, I might offer the guy or gal a beer, but I'm not going to necessarily, invite him to come over to babysit my kids. There's an assessment period that has to happen. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And are these shapes associated with any other characteristics? For example, violence or non-violence or the shutting down of nuclear missiles?
Yeah, Kurt, that's a great question. So there's a difference between when we say something's a potential threat and hostile intent. And I think people have confused the term potential threat. When we say potential threat, as a physicist, there's a lot of things in nature that are potential threats but don't mean to harm you, right? It's for example, I've often said if I go to an airport and I get on a 737, there's no real threat there. But if I were to jump off and run along the runway, the tarmac, and I happen to get too close to one of these jet engines as it's going down the runway, chances are there's going to be some sort of biological consequence. There's an environmental threat to me. I'm probably going to lose some hearing. I'm probably going to get burned by the jet exhaust. It's not necessarily an intended consequence of the jet engine to harm me. And so anytime you're dealing with physics, and I think this topic of UAP certainly nests well within the realm of physics, there's always potential threat. And that's just the way it works. If you ever go to the CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, you're talking about a massive machine, the world's largest machine, in fact, ever built. And it's hurtling some of the smallest particles around nearly the speed of light. And if you look at the shielding that is around the accelerator, it's massive. You would think for something so tiny and infinitesimally small, why do you need such a big machine? Well, it turns out that there's potential consequences when you're taking a particle of matter and you're accelerating it to the speed of light, almost the speed of light. Correction. I think we need to be careful when we go down that rabbit hole and say something is threat versus hostile intent. You said, is there any signs that these things are displaying some sort of overt hostility towards us or violence? I think you said. We in AATIP didn't see any overt signs of, as you say, violence. But there are individuals who have reported that they've had contact, and whatever that contact is, it's not always been pleasant, according to some of the eyewitnesses. Now, the question is, have those eyewitnesses really had a close and personal interaction with this, or is it some sort of psychological manifestation that is occurring? We simply don't know. For that reason, we were very careful not to stipulate any type of intent behind these things. And the only two things we really focused on in AATIP was, what is it and how does it work? We were nowhere near getting to the point where we understood its intentions or who was behind the wheel or the origins of these things. It was simply just, as you can appreciate, a scientific approach. What is it and how does it work? And if we could answer those questions, maybe we'd have a better chance of answering some of the other ones.
Right.
Two, I think there's a fundamental lack of understanding of what we're dealing with. And when you're looking at, for example, the height of the Cold War, and by the way, the efforts of AATIP have been going on for decades. It wasn't called AATIP at one time; it was called Project Blue Book and whatnot. Right. But the bottom line, we've seen these things in our skies for quite some time, displaying these beyond next generation technologies. So we've always known they're real. The problem is there wasn't a whole lot we could do about it. And also at the time, we were thrust in the middle of what we called the Cold War, which, by the way, coincidentally wasn't very cold. It was a pretty hot war, to be honest with you. But
right.
The big threat there was nuclear proliferation, and then the threat of Soviet Union. So those were very clearly definable threats, and you and I were products of that genre. And so that was that's a very clear enemy that you can look at and say, okay, they've got nukes, they're hostile, they don't like us, we're playing this game of chess on a global scale through proxy wars and whatnot. That's a very easy enemy to define.
Yeah.
When you are talking about UAPs, there's two things to determine if something is a threat. We have capabilities versus intent. Well, we've seen some of the capabilities, we have no idea the intent. And since there's no overt hostile action being taken by these things, and a lot of the information at the time was anecdotal, I think there was a conscious decision by the Pentagon brass to say, you know what? Yes, we kind of know they're there, but since they're not bothering us, let's go ahead and focus our time and attention on those things that are bothering us.
Afghanistan, Syria, whatever. Yeah.
But by definition, any technology that is superior to yours in the American military is a threat, isn't it?
It is a potential threat. And for that reason, this is why it is a national security issue. If there is a technology that has somehow leapfrogged ahead of us, that has the capabilities that we're seeing, instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocities, low observability, transmedium travel, and anti-gravity, and it has the ability to fly unimpeded,
over our controlled U.S. airspace at will, and there's nothing we can do about it, yes, that's a national security imperative. That is a problem. That is a potential threat.
When the Fukushima disaster happened, the nuclear breakdown, there were accounts and reports of a huge UAP activity there. And we are talking beams, we're talking them flying around. Have you ever, investigated that case?
Well, let me respond by saying this. It wasn't just Fukushima, it was also Chernobyl as well.
Okay, there was a lot of UAP activity at Chernobyl as well. And
Correct.
Is this information Russians shared with you?
I'm not going to go into the nature and origin of that information. I have it on a high degree of confidence that was also occurring during the Chernobyl catastrophe.
And people have thrown around the agency or term, the Department of Energy. Why is that the Department of Energy significant in this conversation?
Well, because it is. Department of Energy owns the nuclear technology for this country. They are the ones who regulate the classification systems for nuclear energy and technology. And there's a lot of Department of Energy facilities in and around the continental United States. And, they have a very important job, a very important mission. And DOE, if anybody's going to understand nuclear technology, DOE is probably the best place to start.
Yeah. Yeah. And Christopher Mellon, he was on Joe Rogan. He mentioned, something along the lines of they have even less oversight in some of their programs, I guess.
Well, we have reporting of UAP activity over things like Oak Ridge. Pardon me, sorry, my hearing is kind of going off here. Oak Ridge National Laboratory and some of these other facilities where there is a DOE presence. This isn't new to us. There's reporting that's actually in the open public that anybody can look up and read if they want to. And it's pretty interesting. There seems to be some interest in nuclear technology where these things are seen over very sensitive U.S. facilities. I mentioned Oak Ridge because there's some reporting out there that's available, but that's certainly not the only one. There's other ones that have seen time and time again UAP activity, and for me that's problematic.
These, whatever they are, beings, objects, that they're here with hostile intents. It seems like people are jumping from 0 to 100 without actually thinking about everything in between. Right. We're not saying threat in a hostile way. Could you just talk about that and talk on that and how we need to be careful?
Yeah, Vinny, that's great point. Great point. We're looking at this to determine whether or not this is a potential threat. And when you say threat in government speak, it's a very simple calculus. You have capabilities versus intent. Now, we've seen some of the capabilities. We have no idea the intent, so we don't know if this is a threat. Okay. And second of all, there's a fundamental difference between a potential threat and hostile intent. And that's a fact. So I've often said, if I go to the airport and I jump on a 737 to fly to, let's say, Colorado, there's no threat there. But if I were to, let's say, now be on the runway when one of these things is passing by and I happen to get behind the jet engine at the wrong time, there's a biological threat there. There's an environmental threat. I'm going to probably go deaf. I'm going to lose my hearing. I'm probably going to get burned and blown all over the place, maybe break a few bones. So, it's not that the engine is necessarily trying to be a threat to me. It's not an intentional threat. It's just a consequence of the technology that I wound up being at the wrong place at the wrong time. So that's one thing about threat. The other thing is hostile intent. We're not fear mongering here. First of all, we're not even sure if it is a threat. We're trying to determine, is it or not? And anybody who says, well, we already know, and you should be wasting your time on that. No, you don't know. Okay, you think you know, and you want to sit here and tell people that in your mind that this isn't a threat. But you know what? You can't gamble with my life. I'm not going to allow you. You don't have the right to do that. If you want to go ahead and gamble with your life, then God bless you. Go ahead and do it. But don't gamble with mine. Don't gamble with my families. Don't gamble with my friends. Let them make a determination whether or not they think something like this could be a threat to them. And a threat could be anything. It could be a threat to your philosophical belief systems. It can be an environmental threat. It can be all sorts of different threats. We need to figure it out. Is there a potential threat here, which doesn't even come close to yet talking about hostile intent?
Of course.
And I think people will say all the time, well, we want to make sure this is not fear mongering. We're going to use this to go ahead and build, more space-based weapons. That's utter nonsense. We're not there. We're not even there in the conversation.
Yep.
We're just finally trying to determine what the hell this thing is. So, that's part of my frustration I deal with on a daily basis. So you automatically see the hat, right? You see U.S. Army or the intelligence officer, and these are people that when you look at their social media profile, they support all these human rights and whatnot and non-stereotypes. And the first one to come out and say, "Oh, look, he's a military guy. You can never trust him." What?
That's crazy.
I mean, do you not see the contradiction in that perspective? I first of all never said it's a threat. I said we're trying to determine if it's a threat.
Sure.
And by the way, if it's not a threat, then you got nothing to worry about.
Exactly.
Who cares? What do you care what I'm doing with to determine for me if it's a threat or not? If you've already made that mental conclusion that it's not, then God bless you. But don't stop me from doing what I need to do, my own personal calculus, for me to make that determination myself.
Absolutely.
But speaking about the threat narrative, that's a criticism that comes up. People are saying, he's pushing the threat narrative. And I understand that there's legitimate situations which, if it was another, country doing it, we'd be very concerned. But for some reason, if it's aliens, we're going to give them the pass. Right. And I get it. If you've had a positive experience, it leaves an impression on you. So I get that. And I get the ideology behind, if they're so advanced, they know better, they're not going to be harmful. But again, that is an ideology. So let me just get your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, there's a difference between a threat and hostile intent. Okay. Every time I go outside without sunscreen, there's a threat for me getting skin cancer. Okay. It's a threat. I don't know how else to tell people that, there's the threat spectrum is so broad and so wide that it's, I've often told people, if I go to an airport and I get on a plane, there's no threat. But if I go to that same airport and jump on the runway, and now I'm running behind jet engines as they're running, there's a threat. There's an environmental and a biological threat to myself, right, and my well-being. So I think people need to stop worrying about, what I mean by threat. I've tried to make it perfectly clear. Threat is a potential threat, and it can be environmental, it can be biological, it can be purposeful, it can be from a national security perspective. Then you have hostile intent. Okay, there's a lot of things that are threats out there that don't mean to be hostile, and there's a difference. And so what we need to figure out from a governmental perspective is, are these things a threat, and if so, in what areas they're a threat? Okay, and get over the emotional saying, "Oh, kumbaya, we love." Look, what do you care if there's no threat there? Then there's no threat.
Exactly.
Okay? But give me an opportunity to figure that out for myself. You don't make that decision for me. You won't. You never have, and you never will. Just like I don't make that decision for you. And if you want to sit there and sing kumbaya, then do it. I'm not stopping you, but don't stop me from making sure to my own self that this isn't a threat. You don't have the right to tell me that, just like I don't have the right to tell you. So I'd say get over it, and stop trying to drive the narrative, not you, of course, but people out there, stop trying to drive the narrative that this is not a threat, because frankly, you don't know. And if it's not you, then great. Okay, then it's not. But I still have the ability and the right to decide for myself. This goes back to that whole part where people are trying to drive the narrative. Stop speaking for me. I'm not asking you to speak for me. Don't do that. Okay. Don't speak for the government. Don't speak for anybody else but you. And if you think it's not a threat, then great. But you have no right to tell me I don't have the right myself to investigate that for myself. And that's what we're doing. It's called due diligence, and ultimately, if people out there are correct and there's no threat, then you know what? Great. You're right. I'll go buy a beer. Who cares? I don't care, but
yeah, that's one thing I've brought up, but there's no scenario in this where we're victimizing the UFO phenomenon by, exploring the idea of the threat versus hostility. So we don't have to worry about them. Because we're clearly, based on the technology, I don't think we pose a threat to them. I think that.
But I will tell you, I think we have to be cautious superimposing anthropomorphic ideals onto something we have no idea about. It's like swimming in the ocean and swimming in a pool of great white sharks and thinking they're not going to bite you because they're not hungry, right? We have to be careful ascribing human motivations and emotions to something that may at the end of the day may not even be human at all. We don't know. And so, this could be something like artificial intelligence, which is, binary. Do we get mad when the computer spits out a certain search result on Google? No, because that's AI for you, right? It doesn't have the emotional motivations that we have as a human species. And so I think when it comes to assuming or presuming something is or is not, we have to be very careful because we have no basis to make that judgment other than our own. We are looking at everything through the lens of a human being. Perfect example, I've said this before, flying in a helicopter over the Serengeti plain, you want to go ahead and look at the health of a particular herd of water buffalo. You fly over the herd, you scare the hell out of them. They all start scampering. You shoot one with a dart. Next thing it knows, it falls to the ground. It's asleep. We start tagging and tracking and putting little markers on it, all sorts of stuff. We take off in the helicopter and fly away. And all of a sudden that water buffalo or that wildebeest wakes up and goes, what the hell was that? That was a UFO. Oh my God. Yeah. Let alone what the intentions of the occupants inside the helicopter were, right? Because we don't explain ourselves to the water buffalo and say, hey, do you mind if you just kind of stop running for a second? We're going to land this helicopter. We're going to go ahead and dart you, and we're going to go ahead and put all sorts of stuff in your body so we can test, the health of the herd and the migratory patterns and the diets and the reproductive cycles and blah, 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 blah. No, we just do it. Right. So are we meaning to be, is our intent to be hurtful or a threat to the wildebeest? No, but I bet if you were to ask the wildebeest, if they had a choice, they'd probably say, you know what, I'd like to pass on that experiment. Why don't you go to Joe, who's standing over there?